Once upon a time, there lived a king and a queen who lacked for nothing but a child to love. Theirs was a land with a long and storied history, and they yearned for sons and daughters to whom they could bequeath the rich culture and language that they and their people enjoyed. So there was jubilation when word came that the queen had been safely delivered of a baby girl. The king ordered that a great feast be held in a gilded chamber. He and the queen invited their kindred, their friends and acquaintances, and also 5 fairies, the wise women, to be godmothers to the child. Now, in all the best stories, the author tells you what the characters are eating. So I'm going to tell you what they ate at this party. They had seared salmon with creamy dill sauce. They had roast lamb with mint jelly wobbling in a silver bowl. They had fresh grilled asparagus with sea salt and olive oil. A salad of rare and delicate Rapunzel lettuce. There were wines of every color in crystal glasses of every size. And afterwards, everyone could have as much as anyone wanted from boxes of chocolates swathed in violet ribbons. Then the eldest fairy put down her glass and said, "Sisters, now let us give our gifts to the princess." She pointed her wand at the sleeping child, and she said, "I give her grace and elegance, with posture as upright as a shoot of new bamboo." The second fairy said, "I give her intelligence and quick thinking, so that she will flourish at school and get 500 on the Sabre 11. No. Please don't guarantee any specific number," said the third fairy, who thought that children should earn their own success. "Fair enough," said the second fairy. The fourth fairy spoke up. "I give her abundance of language, a rich and lively vocabulary, a command of sentence structure, a feeling for cadence, and warm sympathy for good writing." Well, this was the best gift of all, and the king and the queen were beaming with pleasure. And finally, it was the turn of fairy number 5. "I give her a lovely long attention span, so that she can gaze at length on beautiful art and at the beauty of the natural world, so that she can focus and concentrate and understand what's being said to her, and so that someday she will be able to tackle and enjoy the great Russian novels." Well, everyone was feeling pretty happy about the princess and all the nice gifts when suddenly, boom, the doors of the chamber burst open. There was a thunderclap and the room filled with smoke. As the miasma cleared, the party was horrified to see fairy number 6, an uninvited guest radiating malice. She held in her hand not a wand, but some sort of sleek, inviting device with an apple on it. "Fools," she cried. "Did you think you could keep me out? I have gifts of my own for the baby. I bring her technology and distraction and empty glamour, not just to the child, but to her parents too, and not just to this family, but to everyone in the kingdom. I give them texting and Instagram and Snapchat. I give them Candy Crush, Facebook, and TikTok. My gifts will squander their time, scatter their thoughts, ruin their posture, drastically reduce the amount of time they spend talking to one another, and ultimately make it impossible for them to enjoy long-form writing." And with another puff of smoke, fairy number 6 disappeared. Well, you can imagine the horror on the faces of the king and the queen and their kindred and friends and acquaintances and the fairies. All but one fairy, that is. The third fairy, the one who didn't want the princess to get a guaranteed 500 on the Sabre 11, hadn't had a chance to bestow her present. And now she spoke. This is what she said. "I cannot take back the gifts my vengeful sister has given, but I can give the baby and her parents something that will weaken their evil effects. I give this family the gift of reading aloud. From this night forward, the people who love this child most will spend time every day reading to her. For a long while, she will sit on their laps, and they will show her board books with simple pictures and illustrations, and she may not seem to react. After all, she was only born yesterday. But the king and the queen and the others who love her will persist, and soon the princess will follow pictures and stories with increasing interest. And as she grows, the stories too will grow, becoming longer and more complex. The nightly practice will help to form the mind and heart of this child. And yea, went on the fairy, though technology will batter at this family, and the princess will get a smartphone, same as her friends, when she's old enough to take public transportation, and there will be Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok, for that is how it is with teenaged girls. Never will she lose the cognitive, social, and emotional imprint of those many calm hours happily listening to the voices of her parents reading aloud. The king and the queen smiled through their tears. Could it be? Was there really a remedy for the awful curse of the sixth fairy? And could it be one so simple? Well, today I am going to talk about the gift of the third fairy. I'm going to tell you some of what I learned in the years I spent researching and writing the book that I know as The Enchanted Hour, and that you know as La Magia de Leer en Voz Alta, which I obviously can only barely pronounce. I wrote the book as I was coming to the end of 25 years of reading to my 5 children for about an hour every night. I didn't know at the time that I was coming to the end. That was a bittersweet surprise that my youngest daughter gave me 2 months after the book came out. She was 13. Mummy, she said, would you mind if we don't read together anymore? Well, my heart was pierced, but we must be brave and we must respect our children. I understand, darling, I said. And the next night I began reading to my husband. But during all those years of reading aloud to my children, night after night, I knew something big was happening to all of us. I could feel it. But it wasn't until I began to poke around as a journalist did I discover just how big, how consequential, and life-shaping our reading time had been. I have learned that reading aloud kindles the brain. It enriches emotional connections. It strengthens generational bonds. It perpetuates culture. It fuels language development. It sparks imagination, expands intellectual horizons, and promotes human flourishing at every stage of life's journey. Reading aloud does all of this for children, for teenagers, and for adults, all the way through, and right unto the very end. It is also, I believe, the thing children and families need most for the way that we live now. The bad fairy in the story I was just telling you has come to all of us in real life. I mean, across the world, whole societies are experiencing rapid and sometimes destabilizing change because of the effects of these. So what's happening in the larger culture is happening in the family. Technology is changing how we relate to each other. It is affecting children's brain development, their attention spans, their acquisition of language, and what technology is taking away, reading aloud can restore. It's fantastic, it's transformative, and it does not cost money. I have a lot to tell you. When I finished taping the audiobook for The Enchanted Hour, the final recording came out at 7.5 hours. So we should be done right after dinner. I'm kidding. Oh, okay. First, though, I want to say what a joy it is to be here with you all in person. I attended Fieldbowl last year, but it was by Zoom. And this is so much nicer. The pandemic has taught all of us, I guess, that there is no substitute for the energy that we get from being in a room together. It is also an honor to be here with you specifically, and to be getting energy from people who are engaged in the noble work of curating books, of protecting literary culture, and putting books into the hands of readers. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. Okay, so in the story, the third fairy... Thank you. So in the story, the third fairy gives the gift of reading aloud to a baby born into a world infatuated with technology. She admits she can't do away with the screens and devices that the princess and everyone else in the kingdom will encounter. In the fairy tale, as in our world, technology is here to stay. And my goodness, it's not all bad, right? During the pandemic, it was a godsend. But still, as we know, screens and devices have a way of distracting us, of taking over. We know, and I write about this in the book, that technology does interfere with one-on-one interactions and human relations. There's a phenomenon in the States, we call it technoference. You know, that's the interference in a human relationship caused by technology. You know, you could be chatting with a child and you get a text, you know, chat, 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 you get a text, you turn away, and we all have these moments, and you turn to the phone and the child is erased, invisible, abandoned. Those are strong words, but that is how it feels to children. They say it. So we have our machines, and fortunately we have the gift of the third fairy. So what we lose with one, we can gain back with the other. In the age of screens, what I call the age of distraction, reading aloud can help us to conserve the best parts of being human. What are the best parts of being human? Well, having love, expressing love, experiencing love, feeling close and attached to the people we love. Reading together builds those bonds. Thinking, using our brains, making connections between words and images, between ideas and reality, drawing on our imaginative capacities. Reading together sparks all of that. And aesthetics, beauty. Reading together opens a portal to a world of beautiful things. The visual beauty of art and illustration, the beauty of language in all its variety and quirkiness, the beauty of a well-told story, the beauty of the human voice. Keep in mind that for most of human history, people told stories not by writing them down, but by speaking them out loud, from the brain to the voice to the ear, the oral tradition. And when we read aloud, that is what we are doing. We are drawing on this ancient tradition of oral storytelling. We are lifting the printed word off the page and delivering it to the listener as something to hear. We're turning text into speech. And this is important. Making sense of speech comes naturally to us. It is our first language. We hear it, we begin to pick it up, we start to use it ourselves. Only later, and with much arduous study, do we learn to read and write in a formal way. And some people never do learn. They remain illiterate. Books are closed to them unless someone reads aloud. Because again, hearing a story read aloud means that the listener is getting the language in a form that he or she is designed to understand. And there's another part to this. You and I all know and understand many more words than we use in our everyday conversation. So our receptive vocabulary, that is, the body of words that we recognize and understand, is much more substantial than our expressive vocabulary, which, you know, consists of the words that we typically use. I'm going to give you an example using a wonderful English word that is no longer common. If I were describing an unruly, boisterous fellow to you, I'd probably say, well, he's an unruly, boisterous fellow. If I were writing about such a person, I could choose a more interesting word. I might write, That fellow is a rantipole. Now, rantipole means an unruly, boisterous person, probably young and possibly rather rude. I think it's a wonderful word. But my point is, rantipole isn't something that anyone says anymore. It's not part of anyone's expressive vocabulary, but it is part of my receptive vocabulary, and now it's part of yours. My point is, again, that our receptive vocabulary is a lot wider than our expressive vocabulary. Now, that is true for us. It is also true for children, which means that if we do the reading, translating the little inky marks on the page into a child's native language of speech, children can understand writing that is much more sophisticated than they are. And while that's happening, they'll be picking up new words and consolidating their grasp on the meanings of old words. And even a little bit of reading can have a huge effect when it comes to language acquisition. Young children who have just 2 picture books read to them every day, which takes an adult maybe 5–10 minutes, those children over the course of a year will hear 438,000 words they might not hear anywhere else. Now, in the fairy tale, reading aloud is a gift to a king and queen worried about the welfare of a child who has just been born. In a perfect world, that is when reading aloud would begin in every family, the day the child arrives. Excuse me. Now, a newborn is not going to follow the finer points of plot or characterization. A newborn is not going to study the illustrations in Goodnight Moon and be able to tell the difference between a rabbit tucked up in bed and the cow jumping over the moon. Excuse me. But the newborn will experience the comfort of lying in the arms of a loving reader and of listening to that person's loving voice. And if that voice belongs to the baby's mother, the language circuitry in the baby's brain will spring to life. Something I didn't know when I started reading to my own firstborn 27 years ago, and what we're only just learning now, is just how much reading aloud does for children's cognitive development in the early years, when their brains, when their brains are growing the fastest. Now, to help you appreciate this, let me quickly remind you what is happening inside the lovely little heads of young children. Between birth and 12 months, an infant's brain doubles in size. By the time a child turns 2, the sensitive period for brain development relating to language and other higher cognitive functions is actually peaking. 2 is the high point. By the 3rd birthday, a child's brain has completed 85% of all the growth it will have, and by the end of the first 5 years, a child has passed through all the most rapid stages of development involving language, emotional control, vision, hearing, and habitual ways of responding. So what happens in the first 60 months matters a lot. Neurologists have a saying, nerves that fire together, wire together. Activities that engage the different domains of the brain, that send messages from one part to another, help to make the brain's wiring stronger. Activities that do not engage the different networks don't build the brain's architecture in the same way, or at all. While I was working on the book, I spent some time in Cincinnati, Ohio, with a pediatrician and researcher named John Hutton. He and his colleagues are exploring the effects of reading aloud on the developing brain. I'm just going to walk you through one of their studies. If you've read my book, you'll know what's coming. Their goal was to compare brain activity in 3 distinct situations. When children were hearing a story without seeing pictures, when they were hearing a story looking at still pictures, the basic picture book experience, and then the third when they were watching an animated video. So the researchers put a cohort of children between the ages of 3 and 5 through a scanner, and they ran the scenarios on each child, using 3 stories in 3 different forms, and they saw something amazing. When the children listened to stories through headsets, but didn't see any pictures, There was a bit of mild activation in their brains, but when children in the scanner listened to a story while having the chance to look at pictures, all their different brain domains began to connect and synchronize. The cerebellum, which is believed to support skill refinement, the default mode network, which is involved with creativity, introspection, and self-awareness, the semantic network, which is how the brain extracts meaning from language, the visual imagery network, which is how, the mind's eye, as it were, and the visual perception network, which supports the processing of visual stimuli. So all of this connecting and synchronizing from essentially a picture book. That is what reading aloud can do. It is one of the reasons that the American Academy of Pediatrics maintains that regular reading aloud stimulates optimal patterns of brain development, because it does. Of course, there was that third scenario. When small children in the scanner watched a video, you know what was happening in their brains? Almost nothing. Most of the networks went dark. What lit up, in a manner of speaking, was visual perception. The children's brains could register the shock and awe of animation, but they didn't have time to process it or respond to it the way they did with a story and still pictures. So on the one hand, we have the reading aloud, which is brain building. On the other hand, not so much. Now, that wouldn't matter, perhaps, if children spent very little time using technology, but that is not the way we live now. Millions and millions of young children across the world spend hours every day looking at screens. Before the pandemic, babies and toddlers in the United States were on screens for about 3 hours a day. Now, for you, for me, 3 hours, that's not such a huge time commitment. But we don't sleep 14 hours of every 24. For babies and toddlers, 3 hours is a third of the time they are awake. To put it another way, in this crucial formative stage of life, many children spend 3 hours a day with their brain networks pretty much dark, with machines that do almost nothing for them. So I talked to Dr. Hutton about his findings, and he was gloomy. He told me, it's clear that children who have too much screen time can have deficits in different areas, like language, imagination, and attention. Too much screen time is a setup for atrophy or underdevelopment of these higher-order brain networks. He said it will be harder for children who grow up with underdeveloped networks to learn, to come up with their own ideas, to imagine what is going on in stories and connect it with their own lives. And they'll be much more dependent on information being fed to them passively. He said, I think it's a huge problem, and it's getting more complicated as screens become more portable. There is no natural barrier to use. Well, what barriers there were got knocked over when we all went into quarantine. I mean, we're out of quarantine, thank God, but our devices are more present in our lives than ever before. Now, let's just talk for a moment about the effects of our lavish use of our screens and machines. It's harder to focus and pay attention. It's harder to be present in the moment, even with the people we love. It's almost uncomfortable to spend time offline. I see this at home in the States. When cars have to stop at a red light, you can see all the drivers pick up their phones, you know. And there are darker consequences. Loneliness and social isolation are on the rise all over the world. So are rates of anxiety and depression and suicidal thinking, especially in girls, linked to heavy social media use. Now, I'm not going to go into all that today. I mention it only because we are, all of us, in the middle of a huge cultural adaptation, and there's a lot that we aren't getting right. So it's marvelous that we have a counterweight, an antidote that gives us back some of what our machines and devices are taking away. Technology encourages us to dart and flit, scroll and click, half aware, half focused, half understanding. Reading together is the opposite of that. It is a time of shared concentration, of calm, sustained interest, as the reader and the listener track a text as it unfurls. Reading aloud fosters the capacity to pay attention, which is useful for adults to be able to pay attention. For children, it's crucial, especially at school. In the primary years, teachers deliver most of their instruction through speech, not writing. So children have to be able to follow and understand what's being said to them if they are able to do well as they move up the grades. And the ripple effects stretch far into the lives of children. The attention span persistence, as it's called, of 4-year-olds predicts not only their achievement in math and English at age 21, but whether they'll graduate from college or university by the age of 25. Another thing technology has been taking away from families, certainly from mine, is time spent together. Bonding time. This is another reason that reading aloud is so nourishing. It brings us together in a warm way that is physiologically rewarding. If your parents read to you, or if you've read with children, you know that feeling, that sensation when you settle down with a story. Well, that feeling is based on something real. When a parent and a child sit down together to read, there is a chemical shift. Levels of the stress hormone cortisol drop. Levels of the bonding hormone oxytocin rise. It feels good to read together. So parents who carve out time every day to make reading happen are building a daily dose of that happy, relaxed feeling into their relationships with their children, creating a regular, low-stress point of contact. What feels good in the moment also has lasting effects on both parties. It makes for a better child and a better grown-up. There was a study done at Rutgers University in New Jersey recently. The title is perfect. Early shared reading is associated with less harsh parenting. The researchers looked at a national cohort of more than 4,000 mothers and children and found that, and this is a quotation, shared reading at age 1 was associated with less harsh parenting at age 3. Shared reading at age 3 was associated with less harsh parenting at age 5. Now, why would that be? Well, maybe parents who read to their babies and toddlers are more in tune with them. Certainly, and we know this, children who are read to from an early age tend to do a lot less of what we call in English acting out, misbehaving. Perhaps maybe they are also more in tune with their parents. The Rutgers study attributes the lessened harshness to decreased disruptive behaviors. In other words, reading to a child helps that child develop social emotional skills, which means that parents and children who read together tend to have less friction in their relationships. Now, let us stipulate, reading aloud is not a recipe for a perfect child. I wish it were. But it is a proven way to accelerate a child's development of those crucial social emotional capacities. Empathy, emotional resilience, self-regulation and self-mastery, all of which have to be learned, and all of which are pretty much the opposite of acting out. And all of which make children easier to be with, easier to parent, easier to teach. Children who are read to have enhanced social emotional skills. They are habituated to listening and following the threads of narrative. They know how books work from left to right. And they have spent years being bathed in language, so they tend to have much broader and more elaborate vocabularies. Now, maybe they won't know what a rantipole is, but if, having heard many millions of words, they hear that word in context, they have a decent chance of grasping its meaning. Now, as book lovers, we know that when we take in stories, I mean, it's there in the language, take in, when we consume, we make them part of ourselves. A well-read person, a well-read to person, becomes more comfortably situated in the larger culture, recognizing echoes of old stories in the telling of new ones, being able to pick up on literary references and allusions that their peers might miss, scenes, concepts, characters, historical references, all sorts of foundational knowledge mixed in with odd little bits and pieces gleaned from the books they hear read aloud in their native language of speech. All of this knowledge gets brought to bear when children learn to read for themselves. With any luck, a toddler who listens to lots of stories develops into a child, and then a teen, and then an adult who knows what books can offer and loves to read them. But you know, not everybody is destined to be a great reader. Some people struggle with language, or they're addicted to the screen and they have trouble settling down with the printed word, or they grapple with dyslexia, or other challenges that get in the way of their enjoying books. And for these people, and I say people because it's not only children but many adults who are in this position, for these people, reading aloud offers an incredible way through. Listening to stories read aloud may be their best shot at acquiring anything like the breadth of vocabulary of their more literary peers or able peers. It may be their one chance to have a meaningful experience of literature as literature, not as a movie or TV show, but as the thing we readers love, that immersive experience in which an author's words on the page turn in our heads into what the old radio dramatists used to call the theater of the mind. I want to tell you about a study that was conducted, a 2019 study, conducted through the University of Sussex in the UK. It gives me so much hope. The study involved 10 teachers, 20 classrooms, and 365 young adolescents. These were 12 and 13-year-olds who were not academically strong. Regular English class for these average and below average students or readers tended to be the remedial kind. They would be assigned a single paragraph to read and analyze and explain. The teacher might read the paragraph, they might have to work it out themselves. The point is, they were given short passages. But for 12 weeks, instead of making the children labor over single paragraphs, the teachers read to them. They read challenging novels to them, not slowly stopping at every unusual word, but expressively, at a speed of the sort that you or I might enjoy if we were reading to each other or listening to an audiobook. In other words, instead of whacking the poor children with the English language as if it were a cudgel, they gave them English with stories, with characters and scenes and intrigue and trepidation and shocking outcomes. For 12 weeks, 3 months, the teachers just read out loud to these children, these average and struggling readers. And here's the fantastic thing. Afterwards, the children took standardized tests of reading comprehension. At the end of the study, the average children had made 8.5 months of mean progress. But the struggling students, the testing showed that, I am getting goosebumps, I love this. The testing showed that they had made an incredible 16 months progress. Simply reading challenging, complex novels aloud, and at a nimble pace in each lesson, as the researchers said, repositioned poorer readers as good readers, giving them a more engaged, uninterrupted reading experience over a sustained period. Now that is a lesson, not just for teachers, and not just for those who deal with struggling middle schoolers. That is a lesson for every parent, for every librarian, for every adult who cares about children. I mean, the potential for academic improvement is huge, but there's also a very touching and human side to this. Children who had hated English class were bounding into the classroom, full of excitement to know where the stories would take them next. 17 of the 20 teachers said they felt joy teaching English by reading aloud. Here's a bit from the report's conclusion. Texts read slowly become distant, distended, and disrupted, and reading is experienced as an indigestible product. By contrast, in a faster read, the text becomes coherent, and reading is experienced as a collaboratively constructed, active, and engaged process. And I would say also as a pleasure. In the study, teachers turned reading from a torment into a pleasure. They gave the children in their classes the great gift of reading aloud. They gave them the luxury of enjoying language and a story without having to work at it. And when we do that for children, whether at school or in the library or at home, that is when the magic happens. A door opens, once upon a time. Children go through it, and on the other side, they're in a kind of safe place, a safe room where they can relax and drop their guard. And in goes the vocabulary and the syntax and the grammar, the characterization and the imagined landscapes, the cultural references and turns of phrase, the pathos, joy, comedy, suspense, knowledge, the whole beautiful world of what books make available to us. And all of these good things come to young listeners not as a chore, but as a delight. Any education that neglects this dimension of experience, I'm quoting the British novelist Philip Pullman, who was a teacher for many years. He said, any education that neglects this dimension of experience will be a dry and tasteless diet with no nourishment in it. People, children especially, need this experience of delight. It isn't something you give them as a reward. It's something they will perish if they don't have. Some part of them will perish. Just look at a flower dying for lack of water and then water it. It's like that. I'm sure you have seen that look of mystical refreshment, the transported, slightly stern look on the face of someone lost in a story. It's something else. I mean, you can see from the person's expression that he or she is gone. You can't see what they're seeing, but you know they're not in the room with you anymore. Well, for children, one of the really great things about listening to your parents or a teacher or librarian tell you stories, which is what it's like, listening to someone read to you in your native language of speech, you are not aware that you are experiencing cognitive stimulus or receiving chemical rewards that strengthen your emotional health and the bonds of love that you share with your family. You aren't thinking, I am getting a cultural grounding even as my vocabulary is expanding. No, that's not what's happening. You're thinking about the story, the characters, the scenes. You're thinking, oh, wow, what just happened? What's happening now? What's going to happen next? Well, speaking of which, we never finished the fairy tale, did we? Okay, hang on, where were we? Oh yes, okay. So the third fairy in our story had just given her gifts to the princess, or gift, that is. Okay, here we are. It could. And so it came to pass as the fairy foretold. The princess grew up smart and strong, with a command of language that made it easy for her to express herself with clarity and refinement. Because her parents kept reading to her even after she learned to read for herself, her mind was like a storehouse of glimmering things, full of ideas, personalities, fantastic landscapes, literary allusions, and lots of unusual words. She did well at school, got 443 on the Sabre 11, and she read the great Russian novels. Some years later, when she married the prince of a neighboring kingdom and the two of them had a family of their own, reading aloud became their most treasured evening ritual. The king and the queen were doting grandparents, and they snuggled up on the royal couch with the tots whenever they could. They liked it so much that they began reading in the evenings to each other, and they noticed that their marriage was stronger. What happened in the royal households spread to all the people. And pretty soon, in the way of these things, reading aloud became the norm throughout the land for all of the families. It is true that reading did not happen every single night exactly. Sometimes a council meeting or an agricultural fair would go late, and it was 11 before the children were in bed, and plus it was a school night. There were times when parents had been feasting overmuch and read only a couple of picture books. And I'm sorry to say that on occasion, a mother or father could be heard to say, "The movie was your story tonight." But on the whole, fine things happened as a result of the third fairy's gift. In both kingdoms, at some point every day, for an hour, or half an hour, or just an enchanted 15 minutes, all the people made a point of logging off their computers, silencing their cell phones, and snuggling up to read Sleeping Beauty, and Simón el Bobito, and Treasure Island, and El Libro que Canta, and scores of other wonderful stories to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And do you know what? They all lived happily ever after. Thank you all so much for coming. I would be very happy. I don't know how we're doing on time, whether we have a little bit of time, but if anyone has any questions, I would love to take them, as long as someone can translate them into English for me, because I'm afraid I'm handicapped with Spanish. Yeah, okay. There's a lot we couldn't get to, unfortunately, but...
Okay, Megan, thank you very much.
Of course.
We have a question for the public, and it is how to interest or involve young adults between 18 and 27 years old in reading. In our culture, that age is particularly difficult in reading promotion.
I think that is not just in your culture. I think that is everywhere. I think many of us as parents have seen that our children who were great readers when they were small, particularly with the introduction of this, but also getting very busy with school and college and the excitements of that time of life, that they fall away from reading. I'm happy to say now that some of my children, actually 4 of my children, are in their 20s, that they are returning to reading. So how to interest them is a great struggle everywhere. I think that we have to have some patience with young people, in the same way that when we're reading with them and they're small, if you have a book that you're reading and the child doesn't like it, it's fine, put it away and pick up another one. We all have these very different tastes, and I would say that sometimes in the family context, this is an unanswerable question, is the truth of it. It's unanswerable. I take comfort from the fact that good readers, when they're small, do come back to reading later on. In the family context, keeping reading as part of as a family life is a way to do it. As the adults, if they model reading, if books are around, if we listen to audiobooks on long car journeys, these are ways to keep long-form narrative as part of their lives. But we do have to be patient. We can't make them. After 18, you can't force them to do anything. Actually, after 13, you can't force them to do anything.
Good. We have a second question. This is a kind of personal, and is, which are your favorite books?
This is impossible. It's impossible. I love so many books, and I have so many books in my head. I would say that sometimes my favorite book is the last book I read. Is this for books for reading aloud, or just, yeah? So I loved reading with my children Treasure Island, which is a fantastic book. It's an amazing adventure story by Robert Louis Stevenson. I would say that was one of our favorite stories. We read it. It's a very demanding read. The language is complex. The characters are memorable. You never forget them. That was a great one. We also loved reading the C.S. Lewis Chronicles of Narnia very much. I would say that series and Treasure Island would have been our greatest, most delightful reads.
Okay. ¿Alguna otra pregunta que tenga alguien? Okay, if there is no more questions, I think we want to, yes. I have many children that read with me, and they normally ask to read, but they don't want to read. They only want to see the pictures. How to manage this?
So I'm not sure I quite understand. So is it in the library?
¿Es en la biblioteca? Sí, pero en la biblioteca o en dónde? Yes, in the library.
So they don't want to listen to the story?
They want to listen to the story, but they don't want to read with the reader. They only want to see the pictures.
I understand that. I understand that because, you know, it's pressure for them. It's pressure. And one of the reasons I think reading aloud is so helpful with children is it lets them all off the hook. They get all the benefit of the language. They get the benefit of the story. They get the, you know, everything that a story can give them without the effort. And there's a time and place for effort, of course. But I think that, you know, one of the ways in which reading aloud is so good in schools, for instance. I mean, of course, I read you that example of that study. But, you know, in a classroom, but also in a family, depending on the ages of children, and maybe at a library with different ages, people are at different levels, right? There are some children who are very able, some children who can basically understand things, and some, for whatever reason, are kind of a little lost. But when you give them a story and they just get to listen to it and look at the pictures, which is beautiful, I mean, great. They're developing their minds, but everybody's on the same footing. Everyone is at the same level. So the really adept reader is no better at reading the story that is being told than the very poor reader. And that has there's a kind of social building to that as well, you know, that it builds a feeling of, I don't want to say equality, but it means that everybody's on, you know, everyone's at the same level. They're all the same, enjoying the story at the same time. So I would say, I mean, I don't know exactly the context that you're describing. Maybe you have to make them read, but I think give them the gift of and don't put them on the spot. Just let them read. Let them get what they want from the story. Also, we didn't talk about it here, but you probably are all familiar with this phenomenon of children. They want the same story over and over and over again. And you just think, I can't read the same story over. But do it. They need something. They're getting something from the story, even if as an adult it costs you something. I mentioned that it doesn't cost anything to read aloud, but it does. It costs time, and sometimes it costs patience. But again and again, stories, just letting them listen to them and become more competent at what they're hearing, letting them see those old familiar pictures over and over, is very consoling. You know, it's very enriching in ways that we don't necessarily understand. They can't necessarily tell us, but something good is happening.
Good. An additional question is, if you can elaborate a little more about the role of illustration and pictures in the reading aloud.
Yeah. There is pictures with, you know, picture books. They obviously use a different part of the brain. The processing that we do when we look at an image is different from the parts of the brain that make sense of speech. So this is one of the reasons that the picture book experience is so very nutritious for the growing brain, because it's engaging all of these different domains. And when children can look at pictures, as you heard, that are not moving, they're not jumping around, they have time to absorb them. One of the things I think is very wonderful about picture books as well is it can give children a kind of early introduction to the conventions of art and to different styles of art. Some picture books, and I write about this in The Enchanted Hour, you know, actually incorporate different styles of great art, so that the time reading together a story about a stolen baby. There's a story by Morris Sendak called Outside Over There. And It's a story of I think they're goblins, and they replace a human baby, and then the human baby's sister and brother have to go and get the baby back from the goblins. But the whole thing is illustrated in the German Romantic style. So a child listening to this exciting story about goblins is also taking in some of the style of this painting, this brushwork. And so that, again, it's like building this scaffolding in the mind of ideas and images. So that when that child later in life sees paintings from the German Romantic style, there's a little echo, you know, a little intellectual echo. So it really builds an... Is that me?
No.
Okay. Who is that?
Neighbors.
Yeah. So these are some of the advantages of pictures. And one other thing I should say, I can't believe I didn't even mention this. There is, you know, when we read with children, it isn't ideally, especially if they're young, it's not just a straight, like, you sit still and I read the story and you listen. It's a more collaborative, more playful thing. There's this style of reading that we call in pedagogical circles dialogic reading, right? Dialogue while you read. And this is another place where pictures are fantastically useful, because it's a way to, you can pause the story, right? And then look at the picture and then interact with it. Like, oh, where is the rabbit hiding? You ask the question, and the child looks, and they're practicing visual discrimination while they look at the picture, and then they find the rabbit, and then you congratulate, like, oh, you found the rabbit. Let's find, where is he on the next page? You turn the page, you find the rabbit again. So the child is like playing a game with the pictures, and this also is very good for developing all kinds of capacities, spatial recognition and visual discrimination and such.
Good. We have a final question, and is whether in your research you encounter children with autism, which is a common illness here in our context as well, and how to involve them in reading.
This is very difficult. This is very difficult. I think that, you know, the autism spectrum is wide. And I have talked to parents who are contending with it, about it. And some, you know, I had one mother, she just could not get her son to connect. So what she did was she tried reading with him, and this is you can do when they're little, in the bath. And she just, I mean, I don't know in her case whether it worked. Very, very difficult. Sometimes children on the autism spectrum are very specific in the kind of literature that they will tolerate. They don't want fairy tales, for instance. I know a boy who will not listen to a fairy tale, but he will listen to very technical books about machinery, because that's how his brain works. And so, as I mentioned earlier, to be patient, to be understanding with children, to not hold them to some standard in the read aloud experience that we think they should have, but try to work with them and find things that work for them. You know, this is something I highly recommend. To give them, I mean, this is a conundrum. It is a very difficult thing. Yeah.
Yes. So, Megan, thank you again. And okay, Medardo.
How do you start reading loud? How do you start reading loud?
How do you start? How did I start?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was a book child. I loved to read. I was an only child, and I had divorced parents, so I read a lot as a child. And then I grew up and did other things. And actually, there's a story in the beginning of my book about this. I was with not my husband yet, but we were visiting a friend of mine. We went to, sorry, I'm telling this all wrong. My then fiance and I went to the house of a friend of mine who had started having babies early. And she had, I think, 3 little boys at this point. And they had a nice dinner party, and all the adults were standing around drinking, waiting for the dinner to come. And my friend left the party and went away. And I thought, oh, she's gone to the kitchen. Well, she never came back. She was gone a long time, and it began to be a little awkward. And eventually we asked her husband, you know, where is Lisa? And he said, oh, she's just upstairs reading to the boys. And I felt like something happened in my heart. I thought, oh, if I ever have children, that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to put them first. I'm going to put stories first. I'm going to put reading aloud to them first. It was just like this little explosion in my heart. And then a few years later, surprise, surprise, I got married and I started having babies. I had more than she did by the end. She had 4, I had 5. But as I mentioned, I was an only child. I didn't have a lot of experience of babies. The only thing I knew to do with a baby was to read to it. So my first child was born in Japan. My husband and I brought this baby back from the hospital. I was completely, I mean, you're very emotional when you've just had a baby. I was confused. I didn't know what to do. I felt incompetent. But I knew I had to read to this baby. So I carried her into her little nursery. She was, you know, newborn. And I opened up Grimm's fairy tales and I started reading Cinderella to this baby. And then I felt ridiculous, like she was asleep. Like what was I doing? I burst into tears. And my husband said, let's try this tomorrow. But it was the beginning. It just reading aloud, and I think it's something I didn't put in the book. Reading to my daughter and then to all of the other children actually taught me how to be a mother. It taught me to understand where they were in their development. It was a safe time every day when I might not know what I was doing, but I knew how to read. And from what we were reading, I could learn, I could ask her questions like, you know, where is the bunny or where is the... And, you know, for a long time she didn't know because she was too little. And then suddenly one day out goes the finger and I thought, oh, she knows what my question is, she knows what the bunny is. And from there we developed it. So that's a long story. And I feel sorry for Patrick in the booth who's translating. But that is how I started reading aloud. I feel blessed to have stumbled on it. It was a crutch for me in a way. It was, I didn't have any idea how good it was for my family until I started writing this book. And there are regrets that I have now. I didn't know anything about brain development. Nothing, nothing, nothing. I didn't read them nearly enough poetry. I didn't read them nearly enough nonfiction. I didn't read them enough history. We could have done more. We read every night for about an hour because it was lovely. And like my friend Lisa, I put it at the heart of our family life. It was the center. It was the most important civilizing thing we did every day. And it was civilizing for all of us. But if I had known then what I know now, I would probably have read for 2 hours.
Okay, thank you. Bien, muy bien, gracias.